Hello Internet, welcome to Minecraft Theory. Today we're looking at something that might change how you see Monster High. No, not the dolls, I'm talking about Aphmau's Monster High. And boy, do I have some spooky stuff to share with you about what's really going on in those halls. You know, most of us think we know what monsters are, right? Big scary creatures that go bump in the night. But what if I told you that the monsters in this school aren't exactly what they seem? What if these monsters are actually something much more? Human? Now, before you click away thinking, boy, you've finally lost it. Let me show you some very interesting things from just the first few minutes of this series. Let's start with our first day at Monster High. We meet Kim, who seems like a normal monster student, but pay close attention to what happens when she gets into an argument. She literally loses her head. And I mean that in the most literal way possible. Her head comes right off. But here's the weird part, she's totally fine with it. No blood, no pain, just a casual don't lose your head over it. Now, you might be thinking, well, duh, dude, she's a monster. Monsters can do weird stuff, but hold on a second. Let's look at how these monsters actually behave. First, we've got Mr. Z, their teacher. Notice anything strange about him, he looks completely human. And none of the students think this is weird at all. In fact, they treat it as totally normal to have a human teaching at Monster High. But why would a school for monsters have a human teacher? And then there's the whole prom competition thing. You'd think in a monster school, becoming prom king or queen would involve, I don't know, maybe who has the most tentacles, the biggest fangs, the scariest roar? But no, it's specifically about who can scare humans the best. But here's where it gets really interesting. These monsters have to learn how to scare humans. They need a teacher to show them how to be scary. Doesn't that strike anyone else as odd? If they were natural-born monsters, wouldn't scaring humans just come naturally to them? And let's talk about that birthday scene for a second. When Kim goes to scare the birthday boy, she says something very interesting: never eat a human on their birthday before. Before what exactly? Before becoming what they are now? Speaking of becoming something, notice how the monsters at this school are constantly practicing their scare tactics. It's almost like they're learning to be monsters. Like it's not something they were born as, but something they're becoming. But here's what really got my attention. When Kim and her friend are arguing about the prom competition, they talk about getting first place, not about being the scariest monster, not about having the most powerful abilities, but about winning a competition. It's like they're going through some kind of training program. And have you noticed how easily these monsters can switch between looking scary and looking normal? It's almost as if being monstrous isn't their natural state, but something they've learned to do. Now, I know what you're thinking, boy, you're reading way too much into this. It's just a fun show about Monster School, but stick with me, because we haven't even gotten to the really weird stuff yet. Remember that scene where Kim loses her head? Well, that's not just a random gag. In fact, it's one of many pieces of evidence that point to something much darker going on at Monster High, something that changes everything we think we know about these characters. But before we dive deeper into that mystery, we need to look at some more evidence, because trust me folks, this rabbit hole goes way deeper than just detachable heads and human teachers. But wait, it gets even weirder. Remember how I said we needed to look at more evidence? Well, loyal theorists, buckle up, because this next part is going to blow your mind, maybe even as literally as Ian does. Speaking of Ian, let's talk about what we just saw in his locker scene. This guy keeps dead cat bones in his locker, but here's the really interesting part. He says it was his lunch from last week. Now, you might think this is just typical monster behavior, but let me tell you why this is super weird. See, in most monster stories, monsters eat fresh things. Vampires want fresh blood, werewolves want fresh meat, even zombies prefer fresh brains. But Ian, he's keeping old, dried up bones. And not just keeping them, he's treating them like leftovers. Like a sandwich you forgot in your lunchbox over winter break. But here's where things get really interesting. When the students are facing off against the humans, they mention something super important. They say they're not even in their monster forms yet monster forms. As in, they have to change into monsters. They weren't born as monsters, they become monsters. Speaking of becoming things, let's talk about Ian's special ability. He mentions that if he doesn't win prom king, he'll explode, and guess what? He can actually do that. Just like how Kim can pop her head off, Ian can literally blow himself up. Now, think about this for a second. Why would a monster need to transform into a monster? That's like saying you need to transform into a human, unless you weren't always a monster to begin with. But it gets even better. When they're facing off against the humans, Mr. Z says something very interesting. He talks about the rules like there's some kind of game monsters scare humans, humans try to defeat monsters, blah blah yada yada yada. Why would a serious monster school treat their main purpose scaring humans like it's just some boring old rule they have to follow? And have you noticed how these monsters talk about humans? They're not afraid of them at all. In fact, they seem to know exactly how humans think and act. It's almost like they remember being human themselves. Let's look at how they interact with the humans. The monsters call them babies and act like they know everything about them, but here's the thing, real monsters wouldn't know all this stuff about humans unless they had been human themselves. And did you catch that part about the prom decorations? The humans were working on prom decorations, the same thing our monsters are obsessed with. Isn't it weird how these supposedly scary monsters are so focused on such a human tradition? But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from what these monsters Dante do. Traditional monsters in stories like Frankenstein or Dracula are usually trying to either destroy humans or turn them into more monsters. Right, but these monsters, they're just trying to scare them almost like it's some kind of test. Think about the way Mr. Z watches over everything. He's not teaching them how to be better monsters, he's grading them on their performance, like a teacher watching students take a test that seems really important for some reason. And speaking of important tests, notice how everyone keeps talking about winning, about being first, about beating the others. It's like they're all trying to graduate from something. But graduate from what exactly? Loyal theorists, I think we're just scratching the surface here. There's something much bigger going on at this monster high, something that explains why these monsters can transform at will, why they know so much about humans, and why they're being taught by a human teacher. But to understand what's really happening here, we need to look at even more evidence. Evidence that might just prove these monsters aren't exactly what they seem to be. This next bit of evidence is going to make your head spin, quite literally in Kim's case. Let's take a closer look at this dress shopping scene, because there's something very interesting going on here. First, did you notice how Kim keeps trying to copy everything her friend picks out? Oh, that's mine, I saw that first, but why? Well, think about it, what do new students do when they start at a new school? They copy the popular kids, they try to fit in, almost like Kim is trying to learn how to be something she's not. But here's where it gets really interesting. When her friend calls her out on it, Kim says something super weird. She says, "You're just so fashionable now. Remember folks, this is supposed to be a monster school." Since when do monsters care about being fashionable? That's a very human concern, isn't it? Yes. And speaking of human concerns, let's talk about that dress shopping. Why are monsters shopping for prom dresses at all? In most monster stories, creatures like vampires and werewolves don't care about looking pretty, they care about hunting and scaring. But these monsters, they're worried about what they're going to wear to the dance. But the really big evidence comes when they start talking about scary stuff. Kim's friend says there's nothing scary about being fashionable, and Kim responds by talking about ripping her head off. But pay very close attention to what happens next. Her friend says, "Have you tried ripping your head off?" Right, that's the key word here, folks. She didn't say, "Can you rip your head off?" or "Do you know how to rip your head off?" She said, "Have you tried?" like it's something you have to learn to do, something you weren't born with. And this brings us to another weird thing. Why would some monsters be able to do certain things that others can't? Kim can take her head off, Ian can explode, but not everyone can do these things. It's almost like each monster has their own special ability, an ability that might be connected to something in their past. But there's more. Remember that scene where Kim uses her head as a weapon? That's not just a random gag, it's a planned strategy. She knows exactly how to use her detachable head to scare people. But here's the thing, she had to learn how to do this. She had to practice it. Real monsters don't need to practice being scary, they just are. And let's talk about what happened when Kim got sent to the human world. Did you notice how she wasn't scared at all? In fact, she saw it as an opportunity. She said, "This might be able to work in my favor." Now, why would a monster feel so comfortable in the human world unless they had been there before? This whole scene is filled with little hints that these aren't natural-born monsters. The way they shop for clothes, the way they have to learn their abilities, the way they understand human behavior, it's all pointing to something bigger. Something that explains why these monsters seem to know so much about being human. But to understand what's really going on here, we need to look at one more crucial piece of evidence. Evidence that might just explain why these monsters seem so familiar with the human world. Evidence that might explain why they have to learn to be monsters instead of just being born as them. Let's look at how Mr. Z grades them on their scare tactics. Did you notice how he wasn't impressed by just any old scare? No, he was specifically impressed when Kim used psychological horror. Not brute force, not natural monster abilities, but psychological horror, something that requires understanding how humans think. And speaking of thinking like humans, have you noticed how these monsters talk about winning and losing? About being first or third place? About competition? Those aren't monster concerns, those are human concerns. It's almost like they're bringing their human competitive nature into their monster. Training? But why would monsters need training in the first place unless they weren't always monsters to begin with? Unless this whole monster high is actually something else entirely, something that would explain why these monsters seem to understand humans so well, why they have to learn their abilities, and why they're so focused on human traditions like prom. This next part shows us something really interesting about how these monsters work, and it all starts with a simple chat about decorations. Did you see how our monster friend tried to blend in with the humans? She didn't jump out and scare them. She didn't try to eat them. Instead, she helped them set up for prom. And not just that she tried to make friends with them. Now, I want you to think about every monster movie you've ever seen. When was the last time Godzilla stopped to help set up party decorations? When did Dracula ever ask someone about their hobbies? That's right, never. Because real monsters don't care about being friendly. But here's where it gets really weird. Notice how easily our monster student fits in with the humans. She knows exactly how to talk to them. She knows what questions to ask. She even knows how to help with party setup. It's almost like she's done this before. And let's talk about Pierce for a second. This guy has a very specific fear: circles. Not stakes through the heart, not silver bullets, not holy water. Circles. That's not a monster fear, that's a human fear. It's called fear of circles or cyclophobia. How would a monster even develop a fear like that unless they had experienced it as a human? But wait, there's more. Did you catch what happened when our monster friend got called to the janitor's closet? She needed a dimensional pass to go to the human world. A pass. Like it's some kind of field trip. Why would monsters need permission to enter the human world unless someone was training them? Speaking of training, let's look at how Mr. Z handles this situation. He doesn't get mad that she was in the human world. He gets mad that she went there without a dimensional pass. It's like when a teacher catches you in the halls without a hall pass. This isn't monster behavior, this is school behavior. And then there's the ranking system. Third place. Since when do monsters care about rankings? Monsters in stories don't compete for grades or places, they compete for territory, for food, for survival. But these monsters, they're worried about their scores like they're taking the SATs. But here's the really big piece of evidence when Mr. Z says if Kim pushed you off a bridge, would you jump too now? That might sound like a normal teacher saying, but think about it. Why would he use that specific example? Jumping off bridges is something associated with, well, death. And speaking of death, notice how casually they talk about dangerous situations, getting pushed into other dimensions. Jumping off bridges, these should be life-threatening situations, but these monsters treat them like they're just minor inconveniences, almost like they can't really get hurt anymore. This whole scene is packed with little details that just don't make sense for regular monsters. The way they interact with humans, their understanding of human customs, their fear of getting in trouble, it's all very human. But there's something even more interesting going on here. Did you notice how our monster friend was trying to learn about the humans? Getting close to them? Understanding them? It's almost like she's trying to remember something. Like she's trying to connect with something familiar. And let's talk about that punch bowl scene. Our monster friend knows exactly how to use a punch bowl. She knows where it goes, how to fill it, what to do with it. These aren't monster skills, these are human memories. Memories that seem to have stuck around even after something happened. But the biggest clue comes from how Mr. Z treats this whole situation. He's not acting like a monster teacher dealing with monster students. He's acting like a guidance counselor, someone who's helping these monsters adjust to their new situation. Think about it, the passes, the rankings, the rules about dimensions, it's all set up like some kind of training program, a program designed to help these monsters deal with their new reality, a reality that might be very different from what they used to know. But loyal theorists, this next part is where things get really interesting, because we're about to see something that changes everything we know about these monsters, and it all starts with a simple math class. First, let's look at what Mr. Z says about the prom competition. He doesn't say they need to be the scariest monster. He doesn't say they need to show off their monster powers. No, he specifically says they need to scare the humans at their prom. At their prom. The human prom. Now, think about that for a second. Why would monsters need to crash a human prom? Why not just have their own scary monster prom? Unless the whole point isn't really about the prom at all. Unless it's about something else entirely. And speaking of proms, did you notice something weird about the timing? The monster prom and the human prom are happening at the exact same time. That's not a coincidence, folks. That's what we in the theory business call a parallel event. Two things happening at the same time that are connected in a bigger way. But here's where it gets even weirder. Watch how our monster students act at the human prom. They're not just trying to scare people, they're trying to mess with specific things. The punch bowl, the disco ball, or the decorations, things that would ruin a prom. And speaking of ruining things, let's talk about that disco ball scene. When they knock down the disco ball, one of the humans screams the horror, but what's really scary about a fallen disco ball? Nothing. Unless it's not about the disco ball at all. Unless it's about ruining something that means a lot to humans like their prom night. But the biggest piece of evidence comes from what happens next. One of the humans recognizes our monster friend from math class. Math class. Since when do monsters need to learn math? Since when do they sit in class with humans? Unless they used to be those humans. And did you catch what our monster friend says when they're caught? Math is for dumb humans, but notice how she says it like she's trying too hard to sound like a monster, like she's trying to cover up the fact that she knows exactly what math class is. And then there's the bag on the head. Why would a monster need to hide their face? Monsters in stories are usually proud of how scary they look, unless they're not ready to show their true form yet, unless they're still learning to accept their new appearance. But let's back up for a second and look at how they're trying to scare people. They're not using monster powers. They're not showing off their scary features. No, they're using psychological tricks. They're ruining the prom. They're using their knowledge of what humans care about to scare them. And think about Mr. Z's behavior. He doesn't go to watch them scare the humans. He says he doesn't need to go, almost like he already knows what's going to happen. Almost like this whole thing is some kind of a test he's given many times before. But here's what's really interesting. Notice how the monsters keep competing with each other. Not if I can scare them all first. They're not working together like a monster team. They're competing like students trying to get the best grade. And what about that moment when they're dancing? They know the songs, they know how to dance. These aren't monster skills, these are human memories. Memories that seem to have stayed with them even after they became something else. Remember how our monster friend tried to get punch earlier? She knew exactly where the punch bowl would be. She knew what it was for. She even knew how it was for. She even knew how to serve it. These aren't things a monster would know. These are things a former prom goer would know. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from their reactions to being discovered. When that student recognizes them from math class, they don't attack. They don't try to eat anyone. They panic, like someone who's been caught somewhere they shouldn't be, like someone who's afraid of being found out. We're about to discover something that changes everything. And it all starts with a seemingly innocent clown horn. Let's look at what happens here. First, we've got our monster friend trying to hide their face with a bag. But why? Most monsters in stories love showing off their scary faces. Unless they're trying to hide something that would give away who they used to be. Oh, and then there's that comment about the giraffe. No one is scared of a giraffe. But here's the thing, real monsters don't care if they look like giraffes. Real monsters care about being scary. This is someone who's worried about their appearance. Someone who still thinks like a human. But the really big evidence comes from our clown friend. Notice how he says, I haven't done a clown trick in a bit. That means he used to do clown tricks before. But when? When was he a clown? Was it when he was something else? And let's talk about that horn sound. It's not just any sound, it's specifically a clown horn. But here's what's really interesting. He knows exactly how to use it to annoy people. He knows human psychology. He knows what sounds drive people crazy. These aren't monster skills, these are human skills. But now we get to the biggest piece of evidence, yet Mr. Z, our supposedly monster teacher who turns out to be human. But wait a second, if he's human, why is he teaching at a monster school? What's a human doing teaching monsters how to be scary? Yeah. And did you catch what Mr. Z says when he's caught? We're really underpaid in the human world, not the other world or the normal world, specifically the human world. He's making a clear distinction between two different worlds. But here's where it gets really interesting. The students aren't mad that he's human, they're mad that he lied about it. Think about that for a second. In any other monster story, the monsters would be trying to eat the human teacher. But these monsters? They're upset about the dishonesty. And look at how Mr. Z tries to defend himself. He says he needed this job, but why would a human choose to work at a monster school? Unless he's not just any teacher, unless he has a special role in helping these monsters with their transition. Remember those eyes everyone keeps talking about, the fake eye? The multiple eyes? Notice how nobody is freaked out by the idea of having multiple eyes or losing eyes. It's treated like it's totally normal. Like losing body parts is just something that happens here. But perhaps the most telling evidence is how the monsters react to winning. They're not celebrating eating humans or destroying things. They're excited about being prom queen, about being paired up with someone they like. These are human desires. Let's talk about those horns Mr. Z mentions are real. Why would he need to specify that some parts of him are real? Unless most things in this school aren't what they appear to be. Unless this whole school is built on something that's not quite real. Think about how easily these monsters switch between being scary and being normal. One minute they're trying to terrify humans, the next they're worried about who's going to be prom king and queen. It's almost like they're playing a role. Like being a monster is something they're learning to do, not something they are. And notice how none of the monsters seem surprised that humans can become part of their world. When Mr. Z is revealed as human, they're not shocked by the idea that humans can be in their school. They're just upset that he wasn't honest about it, almost like they understand exactly how someone can go from being human to being part of their world. And now, loyal theorists, we've reached the moment where everything comes together, the final piece of evidence that proves these monsters aren't what they seem, and it all comes down to one tiny phrase that changes everything. You killed him again. Let's break this down piece by piece. First, look at how naturally the humans and monsters start mixing at the prom. The humans aren't running away screaming. The monsters aren't trying to eat anyone. Instead, they're dancing together, having fun, almost like they're not so different after all. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember how the monsters were so focused on scaring humans? Well, suddenly that doesn't matter anymore. Instead of trying to scare people, they're inviting them to party. It's almost like the whole scaring humans thing was just a test they've now passed. And let's talk about that prom king situation. The humans voted for one of their own to be prom king, but here's the weird part: nobody thinks this is strange. The monsters aren't upset that a human won. They're just surprised by how he won through votes instead of scaring. The biggest piece of evidence comes when our exploding friend does his thing. When he blows up, nobody panics, nobody screams. Instead, someone says, "You killed him again." As in, this isn't the first time he's been killed. Think about that for a second. How can someone die again unless they've already died once before? And why isn't anyone worried about him exploding? It's almost like they know he can't really die, because maybe he's already dead. And look at how casually they treat losing body parts. Kim can take off her head. Ian can explode. The guy with the bag is hiding something about his face. But nobody thinks this is weird. Nobody calls a doctor. Nobody panics. It's like losing body parts is just normal for them. Remember earlier when we saw Kim lose her head and Ian explode for the first time? Well, now we know these aren't just random monster powers, they're clues. Clues about how these monsters became monsters in the first place. Think about it, Kim can remove her head. What if that's because something happened to her head when she was human? Ian can explode. What if that's because he was in some kind of explosion? The guy with the bag on his head is hiding something. What if that's because something happened to his face? And look at how the humans and monsters interact by the end. They're not enemies anymore. They're not predator and prey. They're just people. People having fun at a prom. Almost like the monsters are remembering what it was like when they were human. But perhaps the most telling evidence is that final line, never let go of the disco ball. Why would that matter to a monster? Why would a creature of darkness care about a disco ball? Unless it's not really about the disco ball at all. Unless it's about holding on to memories of being human. And think about what this whole prom competition was really about. It wasn't about being the scariest monster. It wasn't about proving who could terrify humans the most. No, it was about learning to accept what they've become. It was about finding a way to connect with the human world they left behind. Because that's what this whole school is really about. It's not a school for monsters, it's a school for humans who have become monsters. A place where they learn to accept their new reality. A place where they can practice being what they've become while remembering who they used to be. And speaking of theories that never die, you know what keeps Minecraft theory alive? You watching more theories. So if your brain is still hungry for more mind-blowing revelations, click that video appearing right here on your screen. YouTube picked it just for you, and let's be honest, the algorithm knows what you like. I'm Matt Pat from the multiverse, and remember, that's just a theory.